11. Excuse me. For there are many who are insubordinate, empty talkers, and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision party. They must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching for shameful gain what they ought not to teach. This morning, we will be hearing the word being preached by Bill Johnson. You can come on up, and he's going to bring forth the word this morning.
Well, good morning. Good to be here with all of you to lift our hearts and our minds up unto the Lord, for He is good. And Pete always leaves me with these easy passages like Christmas, James 5, chastising the rich, all the good stuff. But what are you going to do? Thanks, Pete. The last couple of weeks, more than a couple of weeks, we've been looking at the qualifications for elders as given in the book of Titus. It's quite a list. They're to be above reproach. They're to be good husbands. They're to be teaching their children well, self-controlled, hospitable, just, holding fast the word, steeped in sound doctrine, able to refute error, just to name some of them. So it is interesting to see where Paul goes immediately after his instructions to Titus about finding qualified people to be elders. Because he talks about this qualification, and right away he goes to what they should be doing and how they should be approaching error in the church. Last week, Pete mentioned how our heart is meant to latch on to something just like that clothespin. If you remember that little illustration, the clothespin's meant to latch on to clothes and hang them out, and our heart has this tendency to latch on to things. And one of our problems that lends to what we're going to talk about today is that we live in a capitalistic society, which is good. I like capitalism, to tell you the truth. I think there's a lot of merit to it. And yes, there's bad things to it also, Greed can be associated with it. But we're taught that if we want something, we have to work for it. Nothing wrong with that. If they don't work, they shouldn't eat, And the scriptures teach that, work is good for us. When God placed Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, He gave them a job to do. So, working is something good. But in our society and in our fallen state, that work lends itself to all sorts of things because we apply that spiritually. If we want to please God, we have to work for it. If you want to be holy, you have to work for it. If you want to be spiritual, you have to work for it. And so we set up this whole system of works that we call legalism that we think people should follow, and usually it's our own little set of guidelines that they should follow so that they can be holy. But we just sang a song that Jesus came to break every chain. And it's not just every chain of sin, but He came to break us free from every chain of legalism. Those things that weigh us down from being who we're supposed to be. And God wants us to live in grace. I don't know why people don't want to live in grace or to be grace givers. It's such an amazing concept. If it wasn't for God's grace, I wouldn't be here before you today. If it wasn't for God's grace, I would not have the joy that I have each and every single day. I mean, His grace is so amazing because I'm a knucklehead. I try to read the Word every day, try to pray every day, and yet I find myself each and every single day thinking things I shouldn't think and saying things I shouldn't say and doing things I shouldn't do, and yet God's grace covers me. And it's such an amazing concept, and yet when it comes to others, we have this tendency to place upon them these legalistic concepts. See, we can't please God until we come to the place where we finally find ourselves in such a desperate situation that that we understand that, going to church, being a good spouse, giving money to charity, volunteering, whatever your good works may be, that we finally come to grips with the fact that that will not bring us closer to God. Those things will never please God in themselves. When we finally come to that realization that our sin has separated us so much from Him, that going to church and being a good spouse and being a good parent, being a good worker, giving money, when we finally come to that realization that our sin has destroyed anything we could ever do for God, because when we're doing those things apart from Him, we're doing them for ourselves. It's selfishness. And we finally come to grips with the fact that our sin has separated us from Him. And we're in a desperate situation because God said He will punish sin, and the wages of sin is death. So that when we come to that place and finally come to the foot of the cross and throw ourselves upon His mercy and receive His grace for the forgiveness of sins, can we ever find the joy that He has created us to have? We are called His children when we come by faith to the cross. But the tragedy is, so often, and I can speak from experience, when we come to faith in Jesus Christ, our first tendency is to do what? Make a little checklist. What do I have to do to be a good believer? Well, I can't go see these movies, I can't go this, I can't go that. I went to Moody Bible Institute for 3 years, and they have this little code of conduct. If you want to be a student there, you have to sign the little code of conduct. And my wife is sort of an anti-authoritarian person. So every year at the beginning of the school year, I'd bring home this little slip, and I'd say, we have to sign this. She'd go, I'm not signing that. And I said, well, if you don't sign that, I can't go. Well, I'm not going to sign that because it says you can't go to movies, you can't, dance, you can't do all this stuff. And she's going, it doesn't say that in the Bible. I'm saying, this has nothing to do with that. It has nothing to do with our salvation. They're trying to maintain their reputation. So they're just trying to give us some guidelines here. And after a while, I'd finally get her to sign it. And I don't know what the big thing was because we really didn't go to movies. We really didn't dance. We didn't drink. But it was, Yes, but we knew we could. And the fact that she had to sign it was really terrible. But that's what we do. We like to impose these things on others. And the very first thing that Paul addresses as he comes to the place where he tells the church, tells Titus to appoint elders who have these qualifications, he says, okay, now that you've found these guys, here's what I want you to do. There are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families, teaching things they should not teach for the sake of sordid gain. They're teaching things for their own benefit, to build themselves up. And the party of the circumcision was that party who were Jewish. They've come out of Judaism. They've said they received Jesus as their Messiah, and then they've gone back to the moral law. You got to be circumcised. You got to do these things. You got to do those things. I think a lot of them gave up the ceremonial law because Jesus was the sacrifice. But there were all these other things that they began to put on people. And one of them was circumcision, among many other good things that they shouldn't have. But these people were coming, and what they were doing was they were taking the gospel of grace, and adding to it. Yes, you're saved by grace, but you're kept by these things. So you're not kept by God. James 10, the kids are learning about that today, about the shepherd, and Jesus talks about being the good shepherd, and the sheep hear his voice, and he knows his sheep, and they are in his hands, and no one, the Greek is very emphatic, no one, not anybody, can pry the sheep out of the hands of the good shepherd. And the party of the circumcision was basically saying, oh yeah, you're saved by faith, but you can jump out, or Jesus isn't that powerful to hold you unless you do these things and do them in this way. So they came up with all sorts of rules, probably tithing and all these rules. You see Jesus in the Gospels, man, he hated those people. He hated the party of the circumcision, which I should just say the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees, because they had this whole system set up. And he pronounces woes on them in Matthew 23 because they are just leading people astray. They are destroying people. And that's what Paul says here. He says they are deceivers, rebellious, empty talkers, and they must be silenced because they are upsetting whole families. They are destroying them. That's the problem with legalism. It doesn't help people, it destroys them. And I'll tell you, there's nothing sadder than watching families destroyed because of legalism. I have people in my own family who are legalists, and it just breaks my heart. Because you can't talk to them. Because they know better. They don't when I tried to talk to them, they would say, well, you don't understand. You're not in my house. It's terrible. And I just want to say, yeah, well, you can try to maintain the law in your house, but at 18, they're leaving, and they're not coming back. Is that what you really want? Not only will they leave your house, they're going to leave the church. And that's one of the problems we have today with so many young people. They're leaving the church because of the legalism that was in the homes. They're tired of seeing the hypocrisy of their parents and what's going on in the houses, in the homes where people are saying, the parents are saying one thing at church and coming home and doing the exact opposite. See, legalism sets up the standard that nobody can attain to. And we try to make people fit into the system. Now, there's nothing wrong with disciplining your children. But we're supposed to be disciplining our children out of love, not out of anger. We're supposed to be disciplining our children to guide them and direct them to Jesus. Just as Paul writes, or the writer of Hebrews says, I think it's in Hebrews 13, that God loves us and he disciplines us just like a loving father disciplines his son. You see, there is a system of discipline when we go astray, but the discipline is to bring us back onto the right track, and it's done through grace, not through law. And that's where we really struggle. We all have tendencies towards legalism. The party of, the circumcision, again, the party of the circumcision were the Jews who came into the church and wanted to add law to the gospel, thereby negating grace, and they're upsetting whole families, destroying whole families. When we come to know Christ as our Savior, there's three ways we can basically live. And we struggle with them. First one is we become legalistic. If you're going to be a Christian, you can't do those things. And if I see people doing those things, their salvation is questionable. Man, how can they be saved and go to the bar? How can they be saved and go to a dance? How can they be saved and watch this movie? How can they be saved and dress the way they dress? How can they be saved and tell those jokes? How can they be saved and do this or do that? And we set up this standard. The second way we can live as a Christian is we can live in love. Now that's the way I hope we all learn how to live. Isn't that what the great commandments are all about? You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. It's steeped in love, and that's our goal. That's what discipline is all about, to get us on that track so that we might love God and that we might love others. But legalism is about loving ourselves, because we want people to meet our standards so that we feel good and that we feel okay. So you have legalism and love, and then there's the other one, which is the opposite of legalism, which is licentiousness, which is anything goes. I'm saved by grace. I can do whatever I want. Paul addresses this in Romans 5, where he says, where sin abounds, grace abounds all the more. Well, let's keep on sinning so that we can just experience God's grace. Wow, won't that be awesome? Because the more I sin, the more God just pours out his grace upon me. But that's not what the Bible teaches. Paul says, may it never be. Get that out of your mind. That is not what the cross is all about. That's what receiving God's grace, it's not about that. It's not about going off and doing what you want, and it's not about restricting the freedom of others. One of my favorite verses is Galatians 5:1. It was for freedom that Christ set us free. I think, yes, why don't we want to live in that freedom? Why? Because it's so much easier not to have to try to make decisions if we can just live by law. Oh, that's easy. Should I go there? Well, my system says you can't dance, I can't go there. My system says, well, you can't go to a bar, can't go there. My system says this, I can't do that. When I candidated at a church one time, they asked me the question, would you ever go into a bar? And I said, yes, I would. Holy smokes. Did I open up a can of worms? And I said, I'm not going into the bar to get drunk. I'm going into the bar to build relationships. I said, I go fishing with my brother-in-law who's an unbeliever, and when we're done fishing, he wants to go get a hamburger, and guess where we go? We go to the bar. And he gets a beer, and I get a Coke. Oh, well, it was just going, oh, man. Man, it was for freedom that Christ set us free. The grace that we have is unbelievable. But yet we want to live in legalism, and legalism destroys. What is legalism? Well, legalism is putting law above gospel by establishing requirements for salvation beyond faith and repentance. It introduces rigid moral codes that you have to abide by. In the book of Acts, when Paul was going from church to church proclaiming the gospel to both Jew and Gentile, and the Gentiles were coming into the church, the party of the circumcision was going, hey, wait a second, we are glad to have them part of this, but they have to be circumcised. They have to obey the Sabbath. They have to do this. They have to do that. And there was this big controversy brewing, and Paul went back to Jerusalem, and Barnabas or Silas, I can't remember which, I think it was Silas at the time. They went back to Jerusalem and went to the council, to the apostles, and said, look, here's what we're preaching. Are we preaching the right thing or aren't we? Because, we're upsetting all these people, especially the Jews, by teaching what we're teaching. And the council came back and said, no, you're teaching exactly the right thing. He says in, sort of got off my notes here, but I know it's here somewhere. Acts 15:10, when the council says this, when they tell Paul and Silas they're saying the right thing. Why do you put God to the test by placing upon the neck of disciples a yoke which neither our fathers nor we have been able to bear? That's what legalism does. It puts this yoke upon people that we can't even bear, we can't even attain to, and yet we put it on others, and we usually put it on those who are new believers, and we begin to frustrate them because they come to the place where they say, I can't do this. It is too rigid for me. I thought the gospel was about grace, but man, what I'm experiencing is something terrible. And so Paul, through the council, is able to go back and say, look, yeah, I understand the party of the circumcision and what they want, but this is all taken care of. Jesus fulfilled the whole law, not just the ceremonial law. He fulfilled the whole law for us. Now, that doesn't give us the right to go and live in licentiousness and to do whatever we want. But we do have the joy of knowing that we can serve God with thanksgiving and praise and go wherever He calls us to go and be His servants. I can't remember which evangelist said this, But it goes something like this: if God gave me a round-trip ticket, I'd go to hell and preach. You know, why are we so afraid to go places and to do things when our job is to love others the way that God loved us? And God didn't love us after we got our lives cleaned up. God loved us before we got our lives cleaned up. God loved us when we finally came to the pit and saw how desperate and dirty we were. Then we see how much God loved us. And yet we want to place and impose upon people these things that put them deeper and deeper into the mire that destroys their faith and causes them to walk away from the church, and to walk away from Christ. It is destructive. It just breaks my heart to see churches destroy people. You know, as a pastor for 24 years, I had people come into my church. I remember for a number of Saturdays, this guy would come in, and he would just break down to me, and he would say, you know, we go to this church, and they require all these things. And we just can't do it. And I'd like to leave, but my family has bought into it. And I can't leave. And I see what it's doing to them. But there's nothing I can do. And he said, you know, I'd love to come to your church because I enjoy talking to you, but my family would never come into this church. Once they came in those doors and saw your platform, they would walk out and leave. You know why? Look. Especially that right there. Those drums, they're an instrument of Satan. That's a quote. That's a quote, you know, and it's like, man, don't they read the Bible? You know? I look at Psalm 150, and it's, you know, you're supposed to be joyful, you're supposed to be shouting praises and loudly and doing all this stuff, and, you know, but no. Guitar, keyboard, drums. Oh my goodness. And it was just destroying this guy. It was just destroying his family. And he was grieving over that. It was so sad to see him walk out the door for the last time, knowing that he was going to be stuck there, going to a church that he disagreed with, not finding the joy of his salvation when he went. Because they were steeped in rigid laws that kept them from seeing the grace of God. Oh, just broke my heart. Legalism is so destructive. It destroys our relationships in so many ways. It destroys our relationship with God. Legalism destroys our relationship with God because it puts other things on the plate that you have to be saved by. So, you know, as I said, Matthew 23, Jesus says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte, and then when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself." I don't want the people I reach out to in love, to reach them for Jesus, to become sons of hell. I want them to enjoy a relationship with Jesus. I want them to find his love so that they might extend his love to others. But yet so often we become like the Pharisees and the scribes, and we become hypocrites. And we put loads on them too heavy to bear. Galatians 2:20 through 21, one of the first verses I ever memorized as a believer. "I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I do not nullify the grace of God, for if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly." If righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly. Wow. I am righteous because Christ died for me and imparted his righteousness and his holiness to me. That's the only reason I'm righteous. It's the only reason I'm holy. It's not because of what I do. It's because of who He is and what He has done for me. And anytime I look out at others and place upon them these burdens that should not be there, I am not displaying the love and grace of Christ to others. I am a hypocrite, a Pharisee, and a scribe. And I'll tell you, there's a little bit of all of those in us. And each and every single day, we need to be praying to God to reveal to us those areas where we are hypocrites, where we are Pharisees, where we are scribes, and we're holding others to standards that we should not be holding them to. It also not only destroys our relationship with God, it destroys our relationship with others because we begin to judge them. Have you ever been around people like that who judge you? They will wear you out. There was this one guy, I don't know if he was a believer or not. He started coming to Beloit Road. He was on the baseball team, and he said he was a believer, but I'll tell you, he didn't like anybody. And he would call me up and say, hey, Bill, would you want to come over for lunch? And I would come over, and man, he would just start railing on everybody, even me. And he would just start, and I would walk away from there, and I'd just be drained, emotionally drained. And I kept going to the Lord, man, I don't want to be here. I don't want to talk to him. And I just felt that God wanted me to talk to this guy and to be there. And, this guy would always, every time I would start to say something, he would go, that's the problem with you guys. Nobody will listen to me. Everybody wants to talk, but nobody will listen. And he would just talk and talk and talk. But one day he gave me an out. He said, if you don't want to continue in this relationship, that's fine. I was gone. I was gone. It was terrible. You see, legalism destroys relationships. He kept pushing me away and pushing me away and pushing me away. And finally I got the hint. You don't want me here. And I didn't want to be there. Because he had such a high standard for people to attain to who said they were believers that nobody could meet those standards, even he himself. And he would admit that he couldn't abide by those standards. But everybody else was a hypocrite, including me, and how I didn't care about him and all this other stuff. I said, okay, I'm out of here. I never knew what happened to him. Every time he lived down to by St. Luke's. Every time I drive down there to go to the hospital down there to visit someone, I would drive by his house and I'd look, and sometimes I'd see his dogs out, but I was wondered whatever happened to him. But it was terrible. I thought, this guy just lives alone. Nobody can put up with him. And he can't put up with anybody else. Because his high standards, his legalism destroyed relationships with everybody. And that's what legalism does. I was so thankful he never got married and had kids. Whew. Could you imagine that? What he would do to that poor woman and to those children? Because they would never meet his standards. They would never measure up to him. He would destroy them. And that's why Paul, after giving these standards for elders, says, look, elders need to be like this, to be godly men, so that they might come and approach those who are destroying things in the church and address those issues and correct them or get rid of them. Matthew 18, you go and approach them. If they don't listen, you bring someone else. If they don't listen, you bring the elders. If they don't listen to them, you treat them as an unbeliever. You get them out because they are destructive. They will destroy everything they come in contact with. So it destroys relationships with God, and it destroys our relationships with others because we have to control everything. That's what legalism is about. It's control. Control. I need to control situations. I need to control people. I need to make sure everything goes the way that I want them to go. And parents, we have a problem with this because we want to control our kids, not so that we might help them, but so that we might look good. I don't want people judging me because my kids are running around. I don't want people judging me because my kids are doing this or because my kids are doing that. I remember when my son was in high school, one time someone came up to Ruth Ann and I and said, would you guys teach a class on parenting? Your kids are so good. And I'm going, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know why they're so good. And then about 2 weeks later, I'm at work and I get this call from the school going, Mr. Johnson, did you just call us about your son being sick today? And I said, no. And they said, well, we didn't think that was you. Well, we got a call. Your son's not here. And I tell you, I was on staff at the church and I felt like resigning. I thought, man, I can't even keep my kids under control. You know, I felt terrible. I wanted to come down on him and just blast him. But the Lord said, look, how many times has he given you reason not to trust him? I said, hardly ever. Well, then what's your problem? Doesn't grace cover or love cover a multitude of sins? Yes, Lord. Well, then you need to love him. Do we discipline him? Oh, yeah. The youth pastor came to me that next week when we had a staff meeting, and he said, oh, man, all the kids in the youth group are talking about you. You know, what you did. And I'm thinking, and I hardly did anything. See, my son, that weekend that he skipped school, was supposed to go on a ski trip with his buddies up here in Wisconsin. And he was driving because we had the van. So guess what his punishment was? You aren't going. And they're not getting the van either. So that shot the whole ski trip with him and his buddies. And so, you know, they were all devastated that I would actually do that to them. They had it all planned. They had the rooms reserved. They had all this. Too bad. You know, you want to play your games? I'll play my games. But I loved them. You know, I didn't think it was overly strict. But I'll tell you, sometimes we just come down too hard on our kids because we're afraid of what people will think of us, rather than trying to direct our kids back to Jesus. We want our children to see what? The law? No, we want our children to see Jesus. And I'll tell you, I never saw Jesus in my home. He never appeared to me in a dream per se. He never appeared at the dining room table. He never came and watched TV with us. But you know where our kids see Jesus? They see Jesus in us. And when we become legalistic in our homes, we destroy our relationship with our children, and they never see the love of Christ and the grace of God displayed to them through us. That's what you're supposed to be as parents. I'll tell you, that is such an overwhelming job that after I became a Christian, we already had our kids, and I began to understand what I was supposed to be as a parent. It was like, man, if I would have known that before I had kids, I don't know if I would have had kids. Because, man, that is overwhelming. That is overwhelming to take these little babies and raise them up and teach them and love them with the love of Christ. Because I'll tell you, our kids do dumb things. Our kids say stupid things to us. And I just remember me growing up. Guess what? I did some pretty dumb things, and I said some pretty mean and rotten things to my parents. But there's one thing I knew about my parents. They loved me. They loved me, and they extended grace to me. Sad to say, I don't know if they believed in Jesus the way I believed in Jesus. Hope they did. But I knew that they loved me, and I could see God's love through them. And they are the ones that helped me to become the parent that I needed to become to my own children, because I saw the grace and love of God through them. What an opportunity we have. So how do we defend against legalism? Well, there's a number of ways. First, we appoint godly leaders who will come to us when they see us doing things that are foolish, and they can come and direct us to do the right things. So we appoint godly leaders. I mean, that's how Titus starts out, isn't it? Appoint godly leaders. This is what they look like. These are the people you want in charge of the church. Secondly, learn sound doctrine. It keeps us from doing those foolish things. In fact, Paul writes to Titus 4 times in this book about being sound in doctrine and sound in faith. Now, that's a lot of times in that short little book, how important that is for the church to be grounded in. Sound doctrine and sound faith. So we need to learn sound doctrine. That's why one of the reasons why we come to church. That's one of the reasons why we have REM groups. That's one of the reasons why we're supposed to be reading the Bible for ourselves, praying for ourselves, so that God will teach us each and every single day in every situation sound doctrine, so that we might be sound in our faith, so that we might live for Him. We're supposed to live in love. I'll tell you, if there's one area I'd love to, or I would say, if you're in doubt, err on the side of love. I remember having this conversation with one of the elders at our past church, or one of the guys about one of our elders, and Pete was this godly man, and sometimes I would just think, man, Pete, you got to get past love sometimes and really talk to people. And this guy came to me and he said, oh yeah, I think he's just too loving. He needs to be a little more firm. And we talked for a while and we both came to the conclusion, but I guess if we're going to err on the side of truth or on the side of love, I guess it would be love is where I want to err on, because sometimes our concept of truth is skewed. Truth becomes what we want it to be. And so when we err on the side of love, we come and love people and just display God's grace to them and let God cover the rest. Like I said, love covers a multitude of sin. 1 Peter 4:8, above all, keep fervent in your love for one another. We just need to be lovers. We just need to love people. We need to love life because we love God and He loves people, and we should be asking God to give us His love for others so that we might reach out to them and display His love to them. Because I'll tell you, people are living in terrible situations. People have come through terrible, terrible childhoods and have gone through terrible, terrible things that we will never understand. I never understand Ruth Ann. I mean, we come from totally different families. When we got married, for the first 6 months, she wanted to argue with me every time I got home. We'd sit down to eat, and she would try to pick a fight. And then finally she said, you won't fight with me. And I'm going, what's there to fight over? She says, I don't know, but my parents fought every day. That's what it is, Well, we didn't fight, I had no idea. I didn't know that's what I was marrying into. She had this very dysfunctional family. Well, I had no clue. I was marrying Ruth Ann. I didn't know I was marrying her family. But I was. And we had to work our way through some of those things. But you see, when we love one another, we can address those situations and work through those situations. I could have argued with Ruth Ann. Our marriage probably would have lasted 6 months. When my dad died, which we were married about 6 years. We were at the funeral, and one of my dad's friends came up to Ruth Ann and said, oh, are you Ruth Ann? And she said, yes. And he said, are you guys still married? They never thought we'd make it. 45 years later, here we are. They never thought we would make it. But you see, love covers a multitude of sins. What a great God we have. We could have been legalistic. And if you want to be legalistic, if you want to have something to pin your hat to, Here, let me give you a law that you can be legalistic with. And it's found in Matthew 22, and I've already quoted it. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. You want to be legalistic? That's what you need to be legalistic about. Loving him and loving others. Because the whole law and the prophets depend upon that. The party of the circumcision, you can go all the way back to Deuteronomy, and God tells Moses, I'm not so much interested in circumcision of the flesh, I want circumcision of the heart. And that's what it's about. See, they were involved in the flesh. Paul was involved with the heart. And that's where we need to be looking. We need to become legalistic about loving others so that they too may find Jesus and experience his love and grace, and that you might live in joy, not worrying about what others say, but what God says. For he sent Jesus to die for you to set you free. And what a great realization that should be. Let's pray. Oh, Father, we come before you and we ask for your forgiveness. We are such an unworthy people. We strive to not only do what we need to do, but we strive to put that on other people also. And I pray that you would forgive us for doing that, Lord. Help us to realize that you work with us differently than you work with others. And instead of being destructive, help us, Lord, to be those who build up and encourage. Help us to become lovers instead of legalists. And I ask this all in Jesus' name.